Before we dive in, I have a question for you. If you were in a life or death situation, do you think you would stay calm, or panic? Think about it for a moment. Imagine danger is right in front of you. Would you freeze? Would you run? Or would you stay strong and face it? Let me know your answer in the comments. It was supposed to be an ordinary day at the royal palace gates. The sun was shining, and the sky was clear. Tourists stood outside, taking pictures, smiling, and chatting. People pointed at the tall palace behind the golden gates, amazed by its beauty. The walls stood high, painted in white and gold, looking strong and powerful. It was a place of kings and queens, a place of history. The royal guards stood in a straight line. Their red uniforms were crisp, their black hats tall, and their faces blank. They did not smile. They did not blink. They just stood there, still as statues. People watched them, laughed, and even tried to make them move, but the guards never reacted. It was their job to stay serious. They were trained not to flinch, not to show fear, not to react to anything around them. But behind the face of one guard was a truth no one knew. He wasn't just any soldier. He looked the same as the others. Same uniform, same hat, same serious face. But deep inside, he was different. No one knew his secret. No one knew what he was truly capable of. He had trained for something bigger, something more dangerous. And in just a few moments, the world was about to find out why. The streets were busy. Cars passed by, people walked up and down the sidewalks, and guards stood still at the gates. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed calm. Then, out of nowhere, something changed. A man stepped out from the crowd. He was wearing a black hoodie, his face partly hidden under a cap. He moved fast, pushing past people without saying sorry. His eyes darted left and right, scanning the scene. He wasn't a tourist. He wasn't there to take pictures. Something was wrong. People didn't notice him at first. He was just another person in the crowd. But he walked with purpose, straight toward the guards. His hands were deep in his pockets, his steps quick but steady. Then, in a single moment, everything turned upside down. The man reached into his jacket, and before anyone could react, he pulled out a gun. Screams filled the air. People gasped, running in all directions. Cameras dropped to the ground. Some froze in shock. Parents grabbed their children, rushing to safety. The calm morning had turned into chaos in just a second. The armed man didn't hesitate. He moved fast, lunging toward the closest guard. With one swift motion, he grabbed the soldier by the arm and yanked him forward. The gun was now pressed against the guard's temple. The world seemed to stop. The tourists held their breath. The other guards remained still. No one dared to move. The man smirked, his grip on the gun tight. "Not so tough now, huh?" he sneered, pressing the barrel harder against the guard's head. But the guard did not move. He did not shake. He did not flinch. The gunman expected fear. He expected panic. He expected the guard to beg for his life, to tremble, to show weakness. But instead, there was something else. Something strange. The guard's eyes stayed calm. His breathing remained steady. There was no fear in his face. No worry. No doubt. And that's when the gunman made his biggest mistake. Because the man he had just taken hostage wasn't just an ordinary guard. He was something else entirely. And he was about to prove it. The gunman tightened his grip on the guard, pressing the gun firmly against his temple. His eyes darted around, scanning the faces of the shocked crowd. People were frozen, staring at the horrifying scene in front of them. Some had their hands over their mouths, some had their phones out, recording every second. Others had turned away, too scared to watch. The royal guards, the ones standing in line next to their captured comrade, didn't move an inch. Their faces remained blank, their eyes focused straight ahead. Their training demanded they stay still, no matter what happened. No matter how dangerous the situation was. No matter how close death stood beside them. The gunman smirked. He thought he had won. He thought he had complete control. He thought these guards were nothing but statues, powerless, unable to fight back. "Nobody move!" he shouted. His voice was sharp, filled with anger and confidence. "If anyone tries anything, he dies." But the man he held captive still did not react. His breathing was calm. His heartbeat steady. Inside his mind, he was calculating. Thinking. Watching every movement of the gunman. He could feel the weight of the man's grip, the way his fingers curled tightly around the metal. He noticed how his shoulders were slightly uneven, how his stance was a little off. He was studying his attacker, learning his weaknesses, and waiting for the perfect moment. The gunman didn't know who he had just grabbed. He didn't know that this guard, the one standing so still, had spent years training for moments just like this. Daniel Carter had seen danger before. He had faced enemies far worse than this one. He had fought battles that no one would ever hear about. And he knew exactly how this would end. The gunman glanced toward the approaching police officers, their sirens wailing in the distance. He knew he had only seconds before they got closer. He needed to make his move. "You!" he barked at another guard standing a few feet away. "Drop your weapon. Now." The guard did nothing. The gunman growled in frustration. He pointed the gun higher, pressing it against Daniel's temple. "I said drop it." Silence. Daniel finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, and firm. "You've made a mistake." The gunman stiffened. "What did you just say?" "You made a mistake," Daniel repeated, his eyes locked on the man. "And now it's too late." The gunman opened his mouth to respond, but before he could even take a breath, Daniel moved. In the blink of an eye, the once still guard turned into a blur. His hand shot up, grabbing the gunman's wrist with lightning speed. A quick twist, a sharp motion, and the weapon was out of the attacker's hand. It happened so fast that the gunman didn't even realize what was happening until he felt his own body being flipped upside down. 1 second, he was in control. The next, he was crashing to the ground. The crowd gasped in shock. A few people even screamed. Others just stood there, mouths open, eyes wide, unable to believe what they had just seen. The gunman groaned, dazed and disoriented. He tried to get up, but Daniel was already on him. With precise movements, he pinned the attacker's arms behind his back, pressing his knee into the man's spine. The gun was already in Daniel's other hand, safely out of reach. The man struggled, growling in frustration. "Let me go." Daniel didn't say a word. A few seconds later, the police arrived. Officers jumped out of their vehicles, weapons drawn, but the fight was already over. Daniel handed over the gun, then stood up, stepping away as the officers took control of the situation. The crowd burst into cheers. People clapped, shouted, and some even laughed in disbelief. They had never seen anything like this before. A royal guard, standing still 1 second, taking down an armed attacker the next. It was like something out of a movie. Tourists whispered among themselves. "Did you see that?" One man said. "He moved so fast. I thought the guards weren't supposed to react." Another woman added. A young boy in a red hat tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is he a superhero?" The mother chuckled, shaking her head. "I think he just might be." Daniel stood tall, fixing his uniform, adjusting his sleeves as if nothing had happened. His face remained neutral, calm. The other guards around him were still standing in formation, their expressions unreadable. An officer walked up to Daniel. "That was impressive," he said. "Where did you learn to do that?" Daniel simply nodded. "Training," he said. "And experience." The officer raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, he turned to the attacker, who was now being dragged toward a police van, hands cuffed behind his back. As the gunman was being taken away, he glared at Daniel. "You got lucky," he spat. Daniel looked at him for a long moment before replying. "No," he said quietly. "I was ready." "You weren't." The gunman scowled but said nothing. The police drove away, and the crowd slowly began to settle down. People were still whispering about what they had just witnessed, still trying to process the fact that a royal guard, someone they thought was nothing more than a silent protector, had just taken down an armed man without breaking a sweat. A few tourists approached Daniel, holding out their phones. "Can we take a picture with you?" one woman asked, her eyes shining with excitement. Daniel gave her a small nod, then stepped back into position, standing tall, hands at his sides. The woman laughed, shaking her head. "Wow. I guess that means no." And just like that, the day continued. The crowd slowly went back to taking photos, the tourists resumed their sightseeing, and the palace gates remained as grand and unshaken as ever. To anyone just arriving, it would have seemed like nothing had happened at all. But those who had been there, those who had seen what had just taken place, knew the truth. They knew that today, they had witnessed something incredible. And as for Daniel Carter, he simply went back to doing his job. Standing still. Watching. Waiting. Because a real protector is always ready. Even when the world least expects it. The day had started like any other. The sun was shining brightly, and the air was crisp. The royal palace stood tall, its golden gates gleaming in the sunlight. Tourists gathered outside, excited to take pictures of the grand building. Some held up their phones, snapping photos of the beautiful palace, while others whispered in awe, admiring its size and history. Children pointed at the large statues near the entrance, their eyes wide with curiosity. Diplomats arrived in their sleek black cars, stepping out in their fancy suits and dresses. They walked with importance, their shoes clicking against the pavement as they made their way inside the palace. Guards stood at attention, their backs straight, their faces unreadable. They did not speak. They did not blink. They stood in perfect formation, completely still. Tourists were fascinated by them. Some tried to make them laugh, waving their hands or making funny faces, but the guards did not react. They were trained to remain motionless, no matter what happened around them. They were disciplined, unwavering, silent protectors of the palace. Everything seemed normal. The day was peaceful. Calm. But then everything changed. It happened so fast. Out of nowhere, a masked man dressed in black lunged from the crowd. His face was hidden, his clothes dark and loose. His movements were quick and aggressive. People barely had time to register what was happening before they saw the glint of metal in his hand. A gun. The crowd gasped. Some people took a step back. Others stood frozen in shock, their eyes locked on the armed man. Then screams. Loud. Panicked. Fearful. People scattered, pushing and shoving, trying to get away. Parents grabbed their children, pulling them close. Some ran for cover behind cars, while others ducked down, their hands over their heads. The peaceful morning had turned into chaos in a matter of seconds. The attacker moved fast. With one swift motion, he grabbed one of the guards, yanking him close. The gun was pressed firmly against the guard's temple. Gasps filled the air. Phones shot up, cameras rolling. But the other guards? They didn't move. They stood perfectly still, just as they had before. Not a single flinch. Not a single reaction. Their training demanded it. The attacker smirked, his grip tightening on his hostage. He looked around at the frozen crowd, at the stillness of the other guards, and his confidence grew. Not so tough now, huh? He sneered, pressing the barrel of the gun harder against the guard's head. People whispered in terror. Some prayed. Others just stared, too scared to look away but too afraid to do anything. The guard being held did not speak. He did not resist. His face remained blank, unreadable. But inside, something was happening. Something the attacker did not see. He thought this would be easy. He thought he was in control. But he had no idea what was coming. The tension in the air was thick, heavy, suffocating. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The attacker's fingers twitched against the gun. His breathing was uneven. His heart pounded in his chest. He had expected panic. He had expected fear. But what he did not expect was silence. The guards did not beg. They did not move. They just watched. It made him uneasy. Why weren't they reacting? Why weren't they afraid? He gritted his teeth, shaking the guard slightly, as if trying to force a reaction. Say something, he demanded. Do something. Nothing. The guard remained still, his breathing slow, steady. It was then that the attacker noticed something. The hostage, his eyes. They were not filled with fear. They were calm. Too calm. A strange feeling crept up the attacker's spine. Why wasn't this man scared? His hands began to sweat. The weight of the gun felt heavier. The silence around him was no longer comforting, it was suffocating. He had been in control just moments ago. He had a gun. He had a hostage. He had the power. But now he wasn't so sure. The crowd continued to whisper. People held their breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. A child clutched his mother's hand. Mommy, he whispered. Why isn't the guard scared? The mother had no answer. She could only watch, eyes wide, heart pounding. The attacker swallowed hard. He was beginning to doubt himself. And that was his first mistake. Because what he did not know, what no one in the crowd knew, was that this guard was not an ordinary soldier. He was not just someone who stood at the gates, looking strong and silent. No. He was something else entirely. Something much, much more dangerous. And in just a few seconds, the world was about to see exactly why. The attacker shifted his weight, adjusting his grip on the guard. He glanced at the police cars in the distance, their sirens growing louder. Time was running out. He had to act fast. His hands clenched tighter around the weapon. His jaw locked. He turned his focus back to the guard, trying to regain control of the situation. Move, he ordered. We're leaving. The guard did not move. The attacker's patience snapped. He pressed the gun harder. I said move. And then something happened. Something so fast that most people didn't even see it. 1 second, the gunman had a hostage. The next, his entire world turned upside down. The guard, who had stood so still for so long, exploded into action. In one smooth, powerful motion, he twisted his body, grabbing the attacker's wrist. The gun jerked upward, bang. A shot fired into the sky. Screams rang out. But it was already over. The guard's movements were too quick, too precise. He turned, his elbow slamming into the attacker's stomach. The gun dropped. The attacker gasped, stunned. Before he could even think, before he could fight back, the guard had him locked in a tight hold, his arms pinned behind his back. The same man who had been so sure of his control, who had thought he was the one with power, was now trapped, powerless. The crowd erupted in gasps. People's eyes widened. It had happened in the blink of an eye. The other guards. They were still standing in formation, just as before. Because they had known. They had known that their fellow guard didn't need help. Because this man? He wasn't just a guard. He was a warrior. A protector. A fighter trained for the worst. And today? He had proved it. The air was thick with fear. People stood frozen, watching the terrifying scene unfold before them. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others clutched their loved ones tightly. The entire street, once full of chatter and laughter, had gone silent. The only sound was the distant wail of police sirens. They were coming. But they were still too far. The gunman's fingers twitched against the metal of his weapon. His grip on the guard tightened. His breathing was uneven. He was starting to sweat, though he didn't know why. He should have felt powerful. He was the one holding the gun. He was the one in control. Yet, something felt wrong. He could sense it, though he couldn't explain it. The weight of the gun in his hand didn't feel as steady as before. His heart was pounding harder than he wanted it to. He growled, pushing the gun harder against the hostage's head. "Drop your weapons. Now!" he shouted. His voice was loud, but there was a slight shake to it. The other guards didn't move. They just stood there, still as statues, their eyes locked straight ahead. They didn't speak. They didn't react. It made no sense. Were they deaf? Were they frozen in fear? The gunman clenched his jaw. "I said drop them!" he yelled again, his voice full of frustration. Still nothing. The hostage, the royal guard in his grip, was still motionless. His face was blank, his body calm. Too calm. And then, something strange happened. The gunman finally looked down at the man he was holding. He had expected to see fear in his hostage's eyes. Expected to see panic, maybe even tears. But what he saw instead made his stomach twist. A look. A look that should not have been there. A hint of something unsettling. Was that amusement? The gunman blinked. No. That couldn't be right. There was no way this man was amused. He shook his head, pushing the thought away. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe the pressure was getting to him. But something about that look, something about the way this guard was acting was making him uneasy. The crowd watched, holding their breath. Someone in the back whispered, "Why isn't the guard scared?" No one had an answer. The police sirens were growing louder now. The gunman could hear them. Time was running out. He had to act fast. He adjusted his grip on the guard's uniform. He would use him as a shield, take him hostage, demand an escape. That was his plan. But what he didn't know, what no one knew, was that his hostage already had a plan of his own. A plan that would change everything. The gunman shifted his weight, trying to drag the guard backward. But the moment he moved, the guard moved, too. And in the blink of an eye, the world flipped upside down. Faster than anyone could react, the hostage twisted his body, breaking free from the attacker's grip. His movement was so quick, so precise, that the gunman barely had time to process what was happening before his own wrist was caught in a powerful grip. The gun was yanked from his hand in one smooth motion. The crowd gasped. The gunman's eyes widened. But he had no time to think. In the next second, the guard shifted his weight, using the attacker's own momentum against him. The gunman felt his feet leave the ground. His stomach dropped as his body was flipped over hard. His back slammed against the pavement with a loud thud. Pain exploded through his spine. The air in his lungs was knocked out. He tried to move, but before he could even lift his arms, the guard was already on top of him, his knee pressing into the attacker's chest, locking him in place. The gun, the very weapon the attacker had used to threaten him, was now in the guard's hand. and it was pointed directly at him. The gunman's mind raced. How? How had this happened? Just seconds ago, he had been in control. He had been the one holding the weapon. He had been the one calling the shots. Now, he was the one lying on the ground, completely helpless. He tried to struggle, but the guard didn't let him. His grip was firm, unshakable. For the first time since this all began, true fear crept into the gunman's eyes. The crowd stood in stunned silence. No one had seen anything like this before. One moment, the guard was a hostage. The next, he was in complete control. Tourists whispered among themselves. Some had even forgotten to keep recording. They were too shocked to move. A little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, is he a superhero?" The mother didn't answer. She was still staring, her mouth slightly open. The gunman swallowed hard. His heart was racing. His body ached. He looked up at the man above him. The guard's face was still calm. Still steady. And for the first time, the gunman truly understood. This was no ordinary soldier. This was no helpless guard standing still at a palace gate. This was something else entirely. Something much, much more dangerous. The gunman knew he had made a mistake. But now, it was too late. The police cars screeched to a halt nearby. Officers jumped out, their guns raised, shouting orders. "Hands where we can see them." They rushed toward the scene, but they didn't need to do anything. The fight was already over. The guard slowly stood up, his movements smooth and effortless. He didn't even look tired. He handed the gun to the officers, then took a step back, as if nothing had happened. The officers swarmed the gunman, pulling him up and cuffing his hands behind his back. He didn't resist. He couldn't. As they dragged him toward the police car, he glanced back one last time at the guard. The man who had just defeated him without even breaking a sweat. The man who had turned the entire situation around in seconds. The gunman's lips parted. He wanted to say something, anything. But what could he say? There were no words. He had lost. And he had never even seen it coming. The police shoved him into the back seat of the car. The doors slammed shut. The crowd erupted into cheers. People clapped, shouted, whistled. Some even laughed in disbelief. They had just witnessed something incredible. The tourists still couldn't believe their eyes. One man turned to his wife. "Did that really just happen?" His wife nodded slowly, still in shock. "I think so." The guards, the ones who had stood still the entire time, remained as they were. Because they had known. They had known their fellow soldier didn't need help. Because this wasn't just any soldier. This was Daniel Carter. And today, he had just proven to the world that he was far more than just a royal guard. He was a warrior. A protector. A force to be reckoned with. And the man who had tried to challenge him. He had learned that lesson the hard way. The hostage exhaled slowly. His breath was steady. Calm. Almost too calm for someone with a gun pressed against his head. The gunman didn't notice. He was too busy feeling victorious, too busy believing he had won. He had a hostage. He had a weapon. He had control. Or so he thought. Then he struck. In a single, lightning-fast motion, the guard twisted his body. It happened so quickly that the attacker didn't even have time to react. 1 second, he was holding the man tightly, the cold metal of his gun pressed against his captive's temple. The next second, everything changed. The hostage ducked low, twisting his shoulders, breaking free in a move so smooth, so effortless, that it almost looked like a magic trick. The gunman's eyes widened in shock. His grip loosened for just a fraction of a second, just enough time for the guard to move. The guard's hands once still, once unmoving became a blur. In one swift motion, he grabbed the gunman's wrist and twisted it hard. There was a sharp crack. The gunman yelped, pain shooting through his arm. His fingers opened by reflex, and in that tiny moment, the gun was gone. Disarmed. Taken. He didn't even see how it happened. One moment, the weapon was in his hand. The next, it wasn't. The onlookers gasped. The crowd, silent just moments ago, suddenly erupted in whispers and shocked cries. Tourists clutched their phones, recording every second. People blinked, trying to understand what they had just seen. Had that really just happened? Had a guard, one of the still, quiet, emotionless guards, just taken down an armed attacker in the blink of an eye? The Royal Guards? They still didn't move. They remained in perfect formation, their backs straight, their faces unreadable. Because they knew exactly what was happening. They had known all along. Because the man who had just broken free from his captor? He wasn't just a guard. He was one of the most elite fighters in the world. Trained in hand-to-hand combat. A master of defense. A soldier so skilled that he didn't just fight, he ended fights before they even began. And the man who thought he had the upper hand? He never even saw it coming. The attacker stumbled back, his wrist throbbing, his mind spinning. What had just happened? How had he lost his gun so quickly? How had his hostage managed to turn the situation around in less than 2 seconds? It wasn't possible. It shouldn't have been possible. His body moved on instinct. He lunged forward, fists clenched, ready to grab the gun back. But the guard was already ahead of him. With the same speed, the same deadly grace, the guard stepped to the side, dodging effortlessly. The attacker's hand swung through empty air. Then, thud. A sharp, precise elbow struck his stomach. The gunman gasped, his body folding forward from the impact. The next hit came even faster. A powerful kick to the back of the knee. The attacker's legs buckled. His body dropped. And before he could even try to get up, before he could even think about fighting back, the guard grabbed his arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed him face first onto the pavement. The crowd exploded in cheers. The tourists, the onlookers, even some of the police officers arriving at the scene, everyone was stunned. They had come to see a palace. Instead, they had witnessed something incredible. The attacker groaned, struggling, but it was useless. He was pinned. Locked in place. The same man he had held hostage, the same man he had thought was weak and powerless, was now the one completely in control. The guard, still holding him down, spoke at last. His voice was calm. Steady. Unshaken. "You made a mistake," he said. The attacker gritted his teeth. His breath was ragged, his heart pounding. He had thought this would be easy. He had thought he would be the one giving orders. But now, he knew the truth. The truth was, he had never stood a chance. More police officers rushed in, their guns drawn, shouting commands. But it was already over. The fight the attacker had started had lasted less than 10 seconds. The officers reached for the attacker, pulling him up, cuffing his hands behind his back. The guard released him easily, standing up as if nothing had happened. His uniform was still perfect, his breathing still steady. The attacker, once full of arrogance, once so sure of his victory, was now silent. As he was dragged toward the waiting police car, he stole one last glance at the man who had defeated him. The guard stood tall, his face unreadable. And in that moment, the attacker finally understood. He had never had control. Not for a single second. The police car doors slammed shut. The sirens blared as the vehicle pulled away. The crowd erupted into applause. People clapped. They cheered. Some even jumped up and down in excitement. Tourists whispered to each other, still in awe. "Did you see that?" one man said. "That was insane. I thought they weren't allowed to move." A woman added. A young boy looked up at his father, eyes wide with amazement. "Dad, is he a superhero?" His father laughed, shaking his head. "He might as well be." The cameras kept rolling. The videos spread. The world would see what had just happened. But the guard? He simply turned, straightened his uniform, and walked back to his position. His face was blank once more. His body still. As if nothing had ever happened. Because for him, this was just another day. Just another mission. Just another moment of being prepared for the unexpected. The royal guards remained motionless. The crowd slowly began to return to their usual activities. But those who had been there, those who had witnessed what had just happened, would never forget. They had learned something important that day. The guards were not just for show. They were warriors in disguise. And the man who had foolishly thought otherwise? He had learned that lesson the hard way. In less than 5 seconds, everything had changed. The gunman, who had once held a weapon, who had once thought he was in control, was now lying face down on the hard pavement. His arms were twisted behind his back, locked in an unbreakable grip. His chest pressed against the cold ground, his breathing heavy, his mind racing with shock and disbelief. How had this happened? Just moments ago, he was the one holding the gun. He was the one giving orders. He was the one who thought he had the upper hand. But now, he was helpless. His weapon? Gone. His plan? Ruined. His confidence? Shattered. The crowd stood frozen, their eyes wide, their mouths open. They had seen it all unfold, but they still couldn't believe it. One moment, the guard had been a hostage. The next, he had flipped the entire situation upside down. Whispers filled the air. "Did you see that?" Someone gasped. "He moved so fast." Another voice whispered. "It was like watching a movie." A woman said, still gripping her phone, which was shaking in her hands. A little boy tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, is he a superhero?" The father let out a breath and shook his head. "Son, I don't know what he is, but that was incredible." The sound of police sirens grew louder. The flashing lights reflected off the palace gates, bouncing off the golden edges like sparks in the morning sun. The officers arrived, stepping out of their cars, their hands resting on their holsters, ready for action. But the action? It was already over. They looked around, scanning the scene, expecting a hostage situation, expecting a dangerous criminal standing with a weapon, expecting chaos. Instead, they found something else entirely. A single guard stood tall, his face calm, his uniform still crisp, his breathing steady. And at his feet? The gunman. Pinned. Defeated. Powerless. One of the officers hesitated, his eyebrows raised in surprise. This wasn't what they had expected at all. "Take him," the guard said, his voice calm. No anger. No fear. Just a man who had done his job. The officers moved quickly, pulling the attacker up from the ground. He groaned, his arms still sore from being held in such a tight grip. They cuffed him, securing his wrists behind his back. The cold metal clicked as the cuffs locked into place. The gunman didn't resist. He didn't struggle. Because what was the point? He had lost. He had never stood a chance. As the police dragged him toward the waiting car, he glanced back one last time at the man who had defeated him. The guard still stood in the same spot, his expression unreadable. His hands rested at his sides, his posture straight, his face blank. It was as if nothing had ever happened. The gunman swallowed hard. He had made a mistake. A huge mistake. And now, he was paying the price. The police car doors swung open, and the officers shoved him inside. He barely had time to sit up before the doors slammed shut behind him. The sound echoed through the street. Loud. Final. The gunman slumped against the seat, staring out the window. His heart still pounded in his chest. His mind was still spinning. But one thought burned in his brain. He had underestimated the silent ones. And now, he would never make that mistake again. The police car pulled away, its tires screeching slightly against the pavement. The flashing lights flickered in the distance as it disappeared down the road. The danger was gone. The threat was over. But the memory of what had just happened? That would stay forever. And the crowd? They exploded in cheers. A wave of applause filled the air, echoing off the palace walls. People clapped, shouted, and cheered. Some even jumped up and down, their excitement impossible to contain. Cameras were still rolling. Phones were still held high. The video? It was already spreading. Already being uploaded. Already going viral. The world was about to see what had happened. And when they did, they wouldn't believe it. People rushed forward, trying to get a closer look at the guard. Some called out to him, asking questions. Others held out their phones, hoping for a picture. But the guard? He didn't react. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply turned, straightened his uniform, and stepped back into position. Back to where he had been before the attack even started. Back to standing still. Silent. Unshaken. Just like always. A woman in the crowd laughed softly. He's just going back to work? Like nothing happened. A man beside her chuckled. I guess that's what professionals do. A child looked up at his mother. Will he get a medal? The mother smiled. I think he deserves one. But the guard didn't need a medal. He didn't need praise. He had done his job. That was enough. Because this wasn't about fame. It wasn't about attention. It was about something bigger. It was about duty. About discipline. About being ready when no one else was. And the man who had dared to challenge him, he had learned that lesson the hard way. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove it. The guard never raised his voice. He never looked afraid. He never acted with anger. He didn't brag or show off. He didn't try to make himself look like a hero. But still, he was the one who ended everything. He was the one who took down the man with the gun. He was the one who stopped the danger before anyone could get hurt. He was the one who protected the people around him, without ever needing to speak a single word. That is real power. Power is not always about being the loudest. It is not about showing off. It is not about being the biggest or the strongest on the outside. True power comes from within. It comes from staying calm when everyone else panics. It comes from being prepared, even when no one is watching. It comes from having the right skills at the right time and using them only when necessary. The guard could have fought sooner. He could have attacked the gunman the moment he was grabbed. But he didn't. He waited. He watched. He picked the perfect moment. And when that moment came, he moved so fast, so precisely, that the fight was over before it even began. That is the power of patience. That is the power of discipline. And that is the power of someone who doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. The crowd had cheered. The cameras had rolled. The video had gone viral. People around the world had watched in awe. Who is this guard? They asked. Where did he train? How did he move like that? But the guard? He didn't care about any of that. The very next day, he was back at his post. Standing tall. Standing still. Watching. Waiting. Ready. Because that's what real strength looks like. It is not loud. It is not showy. It is steady. It is calm. It is always prepared. And now, let me ask you, do you think you would have stayed as calm as he did? Would you have been able to wait, to watch, to react at just the right moment? Or would you have panicked? Would you have been scared? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. And remember, sometimes, the quietest person in the room, they're the ones you should never underestimate.